The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Glendy. I'm your moderator today for our webinar, and I'm an executive from BSMA, which stands for Biosupply Management Alliance. And first, this is a cooperative effort between BSMA and our valued partner, Thermo Fisher Scientific. As I said, I'm your moderator for today. And a few housekeeping things before we get started. This webinar is being recorded for future reference, so don't need to take elaborate notes. Just as audience, we're asking you, since you're going to be muted for the entire event, that we're requesting that you jot down any questions that you have as you need to. And there's a facility, if you linked in from your computer, that you can submit questions that we'll do at the end of this presentation. We're planning for about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation content, leaving ample time to direct your questions to our two speakers. So let me introduce our speakers for today. Caitlin Cumming. Caitlin is the Senior Commercial Product Manager for the Bioservices team in Thermo Fisher Scientific. She currently focuses on developing new capabilities and enhancements for the cell and gene therapy supply chain management service line, as well as she engages in key discussions with clients as they're considering the first steps in the clinical supply chain design process. Caitlin has been with Thermo Fisher for 4 years in a variety of product management and commercial roles and has a background in business and global public health. Our other speaker is Amy Hendricks. She's a senior product manager for the bioservices team in Thermo Fisher Scientific, as well as the cell therapy lead for her team. She currently manages cell and gene therapy studies from phase 1 all the way through commercial as a global project lead SME. Amy has been with Thermo Fisher for over 6 years as a project manager and has a background in epidemiology and public health. With that, let's take it away to the agenda for today.
Great, thank you so much, Joel. This is Caitlin Cummings speaking, and I'm going to take you through the agenda as well as the first couple of slides here. And as soon as it flips over, there we go. So thanks so much to Joel for doing the introductions. We're really excited to be here with you today to share our knowledge around designing and executing the clinical supply chain for cell and gene therapy. So first, we're going to start off talking about the risks that you might face that you want to be considering upfront, so you can think about risk mitigation early on in selecting your partners and your vendors that are going to be participating in the trial process with you. Amy's going to take us through a number of different areas and how to think about setting yourself up for success on the path to commercialization. We're going to talk about how to use data to optimize the clinical supply chain over time, especially as you're preparing to commercialize. We're going to discuss a brief case study, and then, as Joel said, we'll be opening it up for questions. So first, just to ground us before we go into more of the content for today's discussion, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the perspective from which Amy and I will be drawing examples throughout this discussion. So as a part of Fisher Clinical Services, we maintain the material integrity from collection to delivery for supply chain management for our cell and gene therapy clinical trials. We've been actively involved in hundreds of cell therapy clinical trials worldwide, as well as distributed material to over 5,000 clinical sites. And we have a global network of GMP facilities that are storing hundreds of millions of samples. And looking at the graphic that you see on your left, which kind of shows the process from cell collection all the way through distribution after product manufacture, which we'll dive into on the next slide, our team participates in executing some component of each step along that process. So just to start us off, I wanted to give a little bit of that context so that you understand kind of where we're coming from as we share examples from clients that we work with every day. So as we think about kind of developing the clinical supply chain, first we're going to think about some of the risks that you're going to face, as well as the complexity in these supply chains. So what's driving that complexity? First, you have many actors, many CMOs, perhaps academic partners that you're working with. You're going to have to coordinate across these multiple actors, perhaps across multiple geographies, as well as coordinate critical materials within a tight time frame in an evolving regulatory environment. You're likely dealing with extremely sick patients. You may have a need to move materials within extremely short time frames, again, across many geographies. And you need to coordinate all of that within a very specific manufacturing schedule to meet these needs. You may be thinking about shipping drug product direct to patient with a just-in-time model, or at least within a specific delivery window. And your product specifications are surely going to be extremely unique. Your therapy may only be suitable for a single patient, after all. So why are we kind of setting the stage and like highlighting some of the importance of the complexities and risks that you'll be facing up front? First, because it's possible as you're examining the various partners that you're going to work with, as you're strategizing, that you can establish risk mitigation techniques. And a big part of this is going to be selecting the right partners to help you in your journey. So while you're going to have to develop in-house expertise to a certain extent across many different aspects of executing your trial, you're always going to need to rely on partners. And I say partners and not just suppliers or vendors, because they're really going to be critical to your success in manufacturing your drug and ultimately in distributing it. So selecting these partners is going to be pivotal to that success. And ultimately, you're going to need to consider who is going to be the right partner to help you understand and anticipate and ultimately solve for the complexities that are inherent in one of the most complex supply chains in healthcare. So some of the areas that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about 4 areas where it's highly likely that you'll really be relying on a supplier or a third party in order to execute this component of your trial. And these are some of the most critical components to establishing and optimizing your supply chain over time. And some of the areas we focus on very explicitly in our work every day, and other areas we discuss with clients very frequently, but they may be working with other partners or vendors. So first, we're going to talk about raw materials and clinical ancillaries, which is really just another form of raw material that you might use in your trial. There are huge scarcity issues in the industry right now, and solving for this early on could really reduce bottlenecks in your process later down the line, especially if you're thinking about a very small phase 1 with only 10 patients that could scale to hundreds or thousands of patients in a phase 3, or as you go commercial. You may not be thinking about the scalability of your materials with such a small patient population up front. Second, clinical sites. So this is likely going to be one of the most challenging aspects of the trial to manage, as there's going to be varying levels of experience in handling certain materials across clinical sites. And ultimately, you just have less control over what's going on in this environment. You may not be able to necessarily choose exactly the perfect clinical site to work with because you may be looking at a very unique patient population or be going into a new indication, outside of cancer, for example, which those sites may be very familiar with handling cell and gene therapies. So Amy will talk a lot about her experience in coaching clients and how to work with clinical sites. Third is qualified solutions. So we're going to think about this from a storage and shipping perspective, which is very close to some of the work that we are doing on a daily basis. Qualified solutions, understanding how your equipment, your shippers your process really is going to perform in the field, is extremely important to reducing the risk to your product and ensuring that it arrives on time and in spec to the patient. Finally, we're going to talk about couriers and shipping lanes. This is often, surprisingly, one of the last considerations before the clinical trial starts, and it truly is one of the most critical, because ultimately the science, the manufacturing process, the raw materials, none of this is going to matter if you can't actually get your drug to patient. So as Amy takes us through this, she's going to help us think a little bit about how we balance risk and cost as we go through setting up the clinical supply chain, optimizing it over time, moving through the phases, and ultimately going on to commercialize your product. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Amy.
And thank you, Caitlin. So thinking about raw materials, When considering your supply chain, it's imperative to assess the full range of supply chain and not just manufacturing. And then quality of material used. What was used in research may not be appropriate or acceptable for use in clinical and then commercial. And then you need to look at global availability, demand, and scalability. Looking at the market demand for this material, can the supplier scale production to meet your needs? Do they have a history of scaling production? There can also be limitations on raw material due to a single source availability and fluctuating manufacturer availability. All of this is useful in forecasting and modeling excess capacity. We had a product that we used for most cell therapy manufacturing and it had a low number of suppliers. And looking at that future demand and all the new studies in preclinical pipeline, it was imperative to start stocking up on the supply in advance to anticipate that in future increased demand. And then clinical supplies, you need to think about how you're going to manage the supplies at the clinical sites and at depots. And then bulk supplies can be cheaper than preparing kits, but with bulk supplies, sites may not be able to use supplies efficiently or before they expire, or they might not be able to store bulk supplies. Kits can help standardize the collection, the administration, and the shipping process, which minimizes variability and deviations at the sites. You can also do other things such as ID and barcoding the kits. You can add the ID to the kits, which supports the chain of custody documentation. Providing the exact supplies to sites that are needed and an ease of use of kits increases the efficiency and maintains the quality and can also save in time and costs. So then moving on with clinical sites, it's important to think about the experience of the clinical site, especially how many other similar trials have they performed? Did they have experience handling cold chain and LN2 dewars or dry ice? Due to repeated site damages and mishandling, we've seen sites trends where it's damaging. We've had to go directly to the sites to train them on how to receive the material, how to handle the dewars properly, and preventing damage. One thing to think about, instead of going to each and every site to train them, setting up investigators meetings with all the sites and bringing the vendors to talk about the equipment and the supplies that they're going to be using is a lot more cost-effective way than going directly to the sites each time and with different vendors. So also, how much do you need to control the process at the sites? Deviations at sites will add pre-analytical variability. And again, kitting can help with this. And barcoding supplies and collection material reinforces this standardization and can be further used to ensure protocol adherence. For example, we had a study using scanning 2D barcodes at each step on a mobile-enabled protocol device that can mobile-enabled device following the protocol can not only minimize errors but also provide real-time data collection and accurate and real-time shipping manifests. The barcodes then allow for tracking the entire life cycle of the therapy and a wealth of data that can be used not only for analysis but also for troubleshooting and improving the process. Lastly, maximizing ease of use for clinical sites and staff. It's very helpful to ask them questions and get feedback from the sites. They can be helpful in determining which supplies work best, which equipment, and their preference on kits versus bulk. It's important to consider the user experience as well and the ease of use at the sites. One example is how easy is it to receive a shipper? Is that shipper too big and bulky for the site to handle? And are the supplies easy for them to use? Is it going to easy to use consistently over time and preventing deviations? So next we move on to qualified solutions. So the next thing to consider is storage and shipping, both at the depot and clinical sites. And what is the tolerance of time out of temp max and collective exposure limits for your product? And how often is storage being accessed? Some units have poor recovery time, so repeated exposures may impact the storage temperature and ultimately your product. Have the vendors worked on validation and feasibility studies run to assess the full life cycle of the material at each stage of your transport, each storage and transport. It's also important to look at label adherence and secondary containers that you might be using in packaging, looking at their performance in your storage conditions, looking at over time. And then from risk mitigation, you should look at your global footprint. When storing critical material such as cell banks, you can mitigate risk by storing in different tanks or even different regions like West Coast, East Coast. And then when evaluating offsite storage and clinical site storage, what are their sites' failure response and contingency plans? Is there a well thought out plan with a fast response? Lastly, if you have international shipments, you'll want to explore the quality and regulatory requirements and how this impacts transit times and modify for appropriate shipping solutions. An example, looking at the whole life cycle of material, we provided support for a study where samples were collected by phlebotomists in the field in California, so obviously hot temperatures, and they were batching their collections for shipping at the end of the day. So in order to maintain that cell viability in this material, we provided phase change shippers to each phlebotomist where they kept them, collected all their material, stored it throughout the day, and then shipped out at the end of the day. So next we have the couriers and shipping lanes. Having a strong transportation strategy is essential for ensuring that your product arrives on time and in spec. As you've discovered, or as you're developing this strategy, first you need to define your requirements. So for your material, what are your lead times for moving the material, and what is the product shelf life and storage temperatures? This will determine a lot about the service level you require to move your product. If you need something to arrive at the destination within 24 hours with a just-in-time pickup and a guaranteed delivery window, Premium Courier is going to be able to make that happen for you. If you have a week, you might be able to use just an integrator. And then origin and destination will determine your primary, secondary, and tertiary next flight out strategy. In addition, what combination of land and air do you need to move your product? Land sometimes more expensive, but can reduce turnover, touch points, and moving your product. And then temperature requirements, as we mentioned, this will help determine what type of qualified shipper you need to use. And then geography will have an impact on both cost and risk. The farther you need to move your product, the costlier the shipment's going to get, obviously, but also you need to partner with a carrier that can handle that global reach. Geography will impact your land, air, and strategy, as well as any customs requirements. So then evaluating your vendors, you need, when you receive a proposal for a transportation provider, will they have consideration for all of these aspects that you're requiring? Will they make a recommendation on the primary, secondary, and tertiary lanes, as well as risk mitigation plans? And you really need to understand time to pick up, what windows do you have for your pickup times and delivery times, which, as we mentioned, in just in time, that can be critical. If you're packaging material just in time, there's a lot of activities that need to happen, and you need a courier who can be flexible and meet the times in order to get the shipments, these critical shipments, out the door and delivered the next day or even same day. And to fully evaluate this, you'll need to understand the performance drivers. What are the on-time delivery rates? How many live leg cold chain shipments have they done? What kind of actions did they take to ensure your shipment clears customs before the product leaves the country? How do they do quality management, respond to deviations, complaints, and CAPAs? How do they qualify and train their agent networks? And finally, what kind of customer service are they providing? Ultimately, specialty couriers are using the same commercial airlines and in some cases, same agents within geographies to deliver product. So the level of service and responsiveness that they provide to you will be a key differentiator in your experience. So next we have KPIs. So you really need to be collecting and using these KPIs to drive continuous improvement throughout your process. And we mentioned the importance of tracking the entire life cycle of cell therapy, but it's also important to track throughout clinical phases and into commercial in order to leverage this data for continuous improvement to support sustainable, scalable, high quality products with reasonable COGS. So here's some examples of some of the KPIs that we would normally collect. For shipping, you want on-time performance. So is it packaged and picked on time, dispatched? And then with the couriers, it delivered on time. And then the time for clearance through customs. Collecting this definitely is helpful in future issues and determining processes for improvements. And also order processing, so time to order, preparation to dispatch. And then costs. You definitely want to be looking at costs over time. And then also by different categories and that by the different processes we went over, and looking at the different orders and reprocessing, canceling. And then inventory, you want to look at the inventory, how it's being moved and used, and if you have waste. And lastly, very important is quality, looking at any trends in quality deviations, excursions, and corrective actions. So to go into a little more details for all the different areas that we talked about, raw materials and ancillary supplies, so kit inventory turns. So collecting this data at both sites and depots, you can look for trends and how to maximize your inventory. And then expiry management. Are materials expiring at either depots or sites? And then lead times for supply planning. How long is it taking to get the supplies from the manufacturers so you can maximize your supply chain efficiency. So next, clinical sites. So a big one for us is shipper turnaround time. When we're sending these reusable shippers to sites, how quickly are they using them and turning them around? If it's sitting at the site for a long period of time, that can have downstream implications, and obviously a big one is cost. And then our sites rushing orders, canceling orders, or making changes to orders. And then deviations at the sites. One we already mentioned was shipper mishandling. Our sites damaging any of the equipment. Are they completing all the paperwork or missing paperwork? And then when they place orders, are they correct first time? Errors can lead to reprocessing or more serious issues. Next, couriers and shipping lanes. So we want to look at on-time performance of the couriers. Are they picking up and delivering on time? And what are their responses to issues, such as customs delays? And not just with the courier, you want to look at customs. Are you seeing trends in customs delays? Are you seeing trends in certain geographic regions? And also seasonal performance issues. Do you see different regions and different times of years have issues? And then complaints and deviations. Any trends you might have with the couriers. So lastly, the qualified solutions. So again, looking at deviations and complaints, but also failure rates and excursions. So failures, for example, the labels. How are these labels performing over time? Because that's also very important. And then shipper hold times. Are the shippers accurately holding the times that they're reported to hold? And then storage excursions. So as we mentioned, if you're accessing storage units frequently, that could impact the unit's recovery time. So if you're monitoring that throughout the process and seeing trends, that's something you can identify and fix. And then temperature monitor functionality. This is also something that we see what could be related to user error, or the temperature monitor not functioning, or just inappropriate temperature monitor was selected. So by collecting this data, you're able to assess what is going on and make changes to your process. So as you can see, this is a large amount of data, so it's important to be intentional with your data collection. And that's what brings me to the next type of data collection, and that's real-time monitoring and collection. In the last few years, it's been an increase with real-time data. So Caitlin's going to go into that a little further.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, so as Amy mentioned, there is no shortage of opportunities to collect data throughout your process, and it's really important to be intentional because data is burdensome to collect, it's burdensome to manage, and you have to decide, ultimately what you're going to do with it, right? So today there's technology readily available on the market that I'm sure many folks are familiar with that gives you way more visibility into your shipments, right? So that's near real-time monitoring that gives you temperature information, GPS location, orientation, as well as a number of other parameters. And it gives you the ability to see your shipment in near real time, understand how it's faring, if there's any temperature excursions that you need to be aware of, any delays going through customs, etc. So, and while each, the peace of mind that this kind of visibility can give you is wonderful, the data also gives you an ability to understand how your shipment is being handled by your courier or by the clinical sites, for example. So tilt, especially for dry vapor shippers, this is really important. They need to remain upright in order to maintain their hold times. So if the shipper is on its side and it's consistently on its side using a specific courier, perhaps you want to look into a different courier or a higher service level in order to take corrective action there. Or shock, for example. If you're getting a lot of shock alerts, that could be an indication that your shipper is being mishandled either by the courier or by the clinical site. And while the shipper should be fairly robust, shock could lead to catastrophic damage to the shipper. Receipt at the clinical site, so there are certain monitors that will give you light alarms that could tell you whether or not your shipper is being opened. And if there is an excursion, there's so much more data to help you understand why there might be an excursion, right? So if we're thinking about a dry vapor shipper, if the shipper has been on its side for 36 hours sitting in customs at the airport, that could be why you get a shortened hold time and it reaches temperature earlier than anticipated. Or if the light alarm goes off and you know that the shipper was accessed before it arrived at the clinical site, you may want to think about doing some additional investigation before actually going forward with the dose of that product. Finally, GPS in its most basic sense. If your shipment hasn't arrived at site on time, you can see where it is by using the GPS tracking. So there's a lot more data. Also, I think it's important to understand that there are certain corrective actions that can certainly be taken if there is an issue with your shipper, but integrators in particular there's not a lot that's going to be done once it's in the system, and couriers as well. There are limitations to that control tower approach. So as you're discussing, what you want to capture while your shipper is in transit, understand what your courier, what your project manager can really do with that information, what's the step that they're going to take, and ultimately it might just be dispatching another shipment if you have another dose available. But those are some of the options and how you can leverage that continuous monitoring information in order to optimize your shippers while they're in transit. So now we're just going to go through a brief case study. So this was a project where we were managing the kit production and distribution activities, kit production for apheresis collection in particular, for an autologous product and a client that was executing multiple clinical trials worldwide. So early on in this process, we established some of those KPIs that Amy was talking about earlier to better monitor the execution of the trial activities, not just for the work that we were doing, but also for other third-party vendors, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you're probably going to be working with a lot of different suppliers, a lot of different actors, and you want to make sure you have KPIs that are going to span all of those actors and help you understand how you're working with them, but how also they might need to work together. So KPIs were focused on-time performance, which is we've said many times throughout this presentation, but also on waste, on costs incurred from both client and vendor errors. So what did this allow us to do? The KPIs revealed that there were additional costs being incurred that were associated with rush orders, reprocessing, and kit expiration. So, you know, the KPIs just tell you high level, this is what's happening in the data, right? So then you got to drill down and do some further analysis. And the client identified that it was actually another third-party vendor that was responsible for those activities where those costs were being incurred. So they worked with that third-party vendor that was managing these processes and managing the clinical sites to identify root causes and implement countermeasures. So while the client ultimately decided to bring some of these activities in-house, they also created processes to address the execution challenges. They redefined some of those third-party vendor responsibilities, and there are a couple different, you know, impacts of that, right? So there's cost savings from better inventory management. There are fewer fees associated with some of those rush or reprocessing issues, and there's improved material management overall, which is a better experience for the client. It's a better experience for the vendors, and ultimately, it's a better experience for the clinical sites. So, and perhaps, a rush order fee or a reprocessing fee doesn't sound like, you know, a catastrophic impact to the budget for your clinical trial, but as you're thinking about going commercial, you really need to be optimizing because every dollar is really going to count. So with that, we'll leave you with a couple key takeaways, and then we're going to open it up to questions. We talked a little bit about understanding how to mitigate risk in setting up your trial and in working with the vendors or partners, as we like to call them, to understand how they're going to help you mitigate risk and how this impacts your cost. We really encourage you to have the right people focused on supply chain early on in the process, especially as a lot of these targets are transitioning from the academic to the industry environment. It's really important to get supply chain expertise in there early on to be thinking about how you're going to take this product all the way from preclinical to commercial. You want to be really intentional with how you're collecting your data, have a plan for how you're going to use it, and understand that you might pivot over time, right? Productivity is about continually searching for new areas to optimize. So if you solve for a certain problem, continue to monitor, but then start to switch your focus to new areas and perhaps retire that KPI as needed. And then really, you're going to drive that continuous improvement not only by identifying those KPIs early on, but also working through regular business reviews with your vendors. And that is relevant really from those preclinical to all the way to commercial phases. So ultimately, we hope that this presentation has helped you learn a little bit more about how to leverage your data to improve your processes, reduce your risk, and strengthen any weak points in your supply chain, again, as you're scaling up to that commercial level. And with that, I think Joel has asked for folks to submit questions, and we are happy to open it up.
Fantastic. Excellent. I think the best way to start on this, we have, while the attendees are submitting questions, some general ones that I've noted here, but also some specific ones. So let's start with a basic one. Are there any standards or best practices that you would highlight? And that's for either of you.
So yeah, we get asked that question a lot. Do you have standards for this or that? And each project is very unique and specific. And so I wouldn't say there's really standards other than, as we mentioned, collecting this data. I mean, as a standard, it's really important to collect this data and look at data in the startup of your project, and then also collect and analyze the data throughout the projects and have regular business reviews to review that data with your vendors. And really that's the big standard that you need to be following to help improve your process and reduce your COGS as you move to commercial.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about it already, but can you touch a little more on how these lessons apply to a commercial supply chain, and how does strong clinicals set you up for commercial success?
Yeah, this is Caitlin, so I'll start that, and Amy might add on a little bit. But one thing that's important to think about is, there's there's so many clinical trials happening right now. There are often companies that are kind of in a race to the finish line to get to commercial. And so obviously efficacy is extremely, extremely important, but so is getting your product to patient, right? So if you have a manufacturing process and lane setup that are going to get the product to patient faster than perhaps a competitor in the space, I mean, that can be a game changer when you get to commercial.
I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, and as I mentioned, COGS. So that's just a big focus in the industry and has been for years. Cell therapy it's an expensive therapy to produce, and so everybody's looking at how can we reduce the costs.
I see. And how about if I'm starting a small phase 1 trial and I have limited bandwidth? What recommendations do you have?
Yeah, so again, it's each trial is very specific and custom. So that, I mean, you really need to evaluate. It's so important to collect this data, but evaluate what data has the biggest impacts.
Yeah, I think we get this question a lot, you know, folks that really want to invest in putting in structures, but they don't necessarily feel like they have the time or the bandwidth or the resources. And especially with small startups that, you know, might start growing rapidly in personnel and people's roles change, it can be hard to kind of keep track. But I think the question is really like, is it worth it? Like, I can probably get away with, you know, flying by the seat of my pants for the first part of this trial, but we would highly encourage you, at least like Amy said, to think about the KPIs that are going to have the biggest impact. And then this is all about driving productivity, right? So you can increase the robustness of your program over time to address the scale and the scale of the issue, the scale of the patients, you know, the global scale of your trial. But at least putting the building blocks in place early on, I think will really show benefits as you're progressing throughout your trial.
And to add to that, so a lot of the companies we work with are pretty small, and when they're starting phase 1, small staff. So you really need to rely on vendors and the right vendors to help you advise on the setup, but also, as Caitlin mentioned, to scale as you move through the clinical phases.
Yes, that was a follow-up question I had on. You initially had talked about partnering and the importance in your pillars. So when you were looking at two of the areas of the pillars you referred to, the qualified solutions and the couriers and shipping lanes, what are some areas that you really need to hone in on and partnering when you're assessing who a good partner would be? And, you know, without trying to solve it in this discussion, are there certain warning signs or certain weaknesses that you want to be honing in on before you select partners?
I don't know if they're necessarily weaknesses, because as Amy said, it's kind of like thinking about your best practices, right? Your trial is going to be unique, your product is unique, the specifications are unique. So how adaptive are the vendors that you're considering how adaptive are they to these unique specifications, right? Quality management is obviously going to be a huge issue across all of your vendors, so making sure they have robust quality systems. I'd say that could be a red flag early on if they don't have strong quality management systems. But ultimately, you're going to require a certain level of responsiveness, like around customer service. I think that's really important. And just making sure that you are building a level of trust with these vendors, because you're going to be working very closely with them, and likely your relationship will be growing over time. So you want to make sure that they're somebody that you can grow with, and if they're not, have a plan for how you want to, you know, potentially change vendors down the line to address, again, those issues of scale.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're starting to get questions populating here. So the first one is referring to the key takeaway that you had on leveraging data to improve the process. What can you talk to on IT solutions that are being used in the industry, and how you're integrating this with your customers and partners?
Well, so I think there's a couple of different options here. So especially as you're thinking about like early phases, you may, and especially small patient populations, you may not need a very robust, IT solution to help manage all this data. You're going to likely have to amalgamate it from a number of different sources. But, in our instance, right, we are using inventory management systems. There may be a transportation management system that your courier is using. And then you may also be using IRT systems. So likely there's going to be a lot of different pieces that need to be brought together. There are technology solutions available in the market right now that are specifically targeted towards autologous therapies that can help with some of the, scheduling and managing of getting drug back to patient, which I believe, if there's room to invest in, have been very effective in the market. But like in a lot of the projects that we're working on, we're really working with the clients to determine what kind of solutions that they have in place, and then how we can bring the pieces together to aggregate all this data, which sometimes is in a simple Excel spreadsheet, depending on the type of infrastructure that they might have, and otherwise might be leveraging more robust kind of project management tools.
Makes sense. Management tools like Microsoft Project, or more detailed ones that are integrated into the supply chain, political supply chain. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, like IRT. So
got it. Mm-hmm.
And there's also, depending on how much data and how complex, and there's even third-party vendors that you can use to integrate all the data between the different vendors in one location that also is cloud enabled, so everybody's able to access, or you can control access to certain data, but it's there for everybody real time.
Got it. Hey, next, one of the attendees has asked about product security, especially in the T-cell arena. Basically, how does one ensure that what is returned actually is what was sent? Good question.
So that's where chain of custody documentation is very critical, and then also having tamper evidence. You can have tamper evidence on the secondary packaging, but also on the doers themselves, and tamper evidence that's serialized, and so that is then carried over into your chain of custody documentation, and then having the procedures in place to check for all of that, and how to handle discrepancies. So having strong quality backgrounds and measurements in place.
I see. Yeah, can be a critical one.
We definitely stress chain of custody documentation is very important, especially when handling, as you said, the returns.
Okay. Next submitted is about cell and gene therapies. There's seem to be focused on very specific small patient disease states. Do you see any large volume commercial opportunities coming in the space in the future?
Certainly. I mean, I think the world is expanding every day with new opportunities, and especially as folks shift more into the allogeneic space. We did focus a lot on kind of small volume scaling from phase 1, because that's been a lot of the experience in previous years, a lot of focus on autologous CAR T, right? But that's changing. Companies are starting to change their perspective, and really, because it's going to make more economic sense, right, from a reimbursement perspective, to be able to address more patients and reduce costs in the manufacturing process, as Amy was saying. So I believe there's the targets, or the expected number of approvals is 10 to 20 approvals in the next several years going commercial. And I think that we'll start to see, especially as the technology advances, start to see that going after more and more large volume indications.
And then we're also seeing cell therapies used for chronic diseases too. So not just cancers and small patient studies. we're seeing the studies and there's a great need for it. So there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, interesting. That's good for our future for sure. I have a question, and you had mentioned, which I thought was so important, is that as you're assessing the experience of the clinical sites, are there any like key things when you're doing that you want to, as takeaways here, that you can share with both good things and challenges that you've experienced on clinical sites, both domestically, internationally as well?
Oh yeah, sure. So this is always going to be a difficult aspect. Dealing with a GMP facility versus a clinical site are two very different areas, and one is a lot easier to control, the other one not so much. And some good things is that cell therapy is becoming more and more prevalent, so sites are becoming more and more experienced in handling this material and the different equipment associated with it. But as I mentioned, some sites still not so much. Like as we're moving into more chronic diseases, you'll start seeing sites who have never seen this type of material before. And one comment I have from a site, we send the doer and they see this and what is this? This is so foreign to them. It looks like a bomb. It's just
right.
It's just completely different world for them. So you really have to assess these sites' ability to handle this and ensure that you do plenty of upfront training, but training throughout, and having things like site reminders, site newsletters is really important. So constant training throughout, because these sites may also have turnover, and that critical training that you did in the beginning is not going to have the same weight a year later.
Yeah, timing.
Yeah, one thing to add to that too is that sometimes patient enrollment can be much slower than anticipated. So you may do a meeting with an investigator meeting early on, and it takes way longer to recruit your patients, and it could be 6 months to a year later. And like Amy said, it could have been dramatic turnover, or just people forget. Constant training is a really important aspect of strong execution.
And I had mentioned doing a mobile app device that digital controlling of the protocols and pairing that with scanning barcodes. And we found that was a really great way to control sites, because they're really limited by following that protocol. They can't move on to the next step until they've scanned that exact item that they're going to be using. And that was a really great way to minimize any deviations. It's a lot of money and work to set up in the beginning, but really worth it in the long run.
Right, and it's personalized in an app format. Is that how you're saying it?
Yeah. Yeah, so like a mobile app has that protocol.
Good. If anyone else has any questions, you need to submit them now. I've got a couple more to ask before we conclude. But my next question really is about storage and shipping solutions, and kind of you had mentioned about real-time monitoring, the documentation for that. You can speak more to that on this risk mitigation side, and typical monitoring and records needed side. So do you have templates for this to aid the client in this, or how is that, or from your experience on that, how is that evolving in our industry?
So from a continuous monitoring perspective, there are certain ways to customize, which we would work with the client on what their requirements are and what they want to see and what they need to see based on their product and based on their perceived level of risk. But the reporting is actually fairly standard, because the monitor will produce the 21 CFR Part 11 compliant report, and that's all it will produce, because that's what clients need for their chain of custody and their chain of temperature. From a storage perspective and how we manage that, I will look to Amy.
Okay.
Any comments?
I mean, again, we do have templates and standards, which I'd say most companies would have that, but we work with our specific clients in a very collaborative way to develop client-specific protocols and data reporting.
And one thing I'll add to that is just interpreting your question a little bit. I mean, your product should be monitored for condition at all times, right? So when we receive a product, it should have, there should be temperature monitoring on the device in which we receive it. It will be monitored when it's moved between environments, and often the time between moving it, even from the shipper to what we use in our facility, CryoCart, then back into the LN2 tank, you know, it would be the time between all of these steps would be monitored. Each vessel that it's put in would be monitored and validated to perform at that temperature. And then there, you know, we provide clients with reports of how the tank or the refrigerator performs at their request if they're interested. And then any deviations would obviously be tracked. Preventative maintenance is conducted on all equipment, and you know, no matter who you're using or if you're storing stuff in-house, we would highly recommend that, you know, following any preventative maintenance schedules. But overall, there should be continuous monitoring of your product, whether it's in transit or, you know, stationary and storage in a facility. And then, you know, for example, if you're packaging and labeling and executing your batch record, we would also be tracking, you know, how the material is moving, again, from the tank to the packaging environment, then ultimately to the shipper, and making sure that we're maintaining the conditions that it requires, as well as tracking the, you know, the total time out of temperature, because the total allowed time out of temperature could be very, very slim for the life of the product.
I see. You had talked about one last thing in this area on couriers and shipping lanes and kind of the packaging required and the seasonality effect, and then on temperature, obviously, but also as it relates to shock. What are you seeing in terms of variability once you get your primary, secondary lanes in place? Are you seeing a lot of variability? Are you trying to capture all the worst case scenarios in your clinical studies? How are you approaching that in supporting the client?
Generally, we would think about the worst case scenario when we're thinking about risk, right? So what's the worst thing that could happen? When you're thinking about your lanes, we have an in-house specialty courier, and they would recommend, like I said, primary, secondary, and tertiary lanes, first of all, from your origin and destination pairs. And the backup plans that we're referring to that primarily would address the seasonality issues are really around missed flights. So like if you're shipping in a dry vapor shipper, for example, the impact of extreme heat or extreme cold is probably not going to impact the maximum hold time of the shipper very much. But what is going to impact it is if there's a huge snowstorm and your product can't get out of, you know, its origin point to get to its destination, right? Or if there's a hurricane or a volcano eruption, right? These things can't necessarily be predicted. They're also, you know, a volcano eruption isn't necessarily something that happens every single day. But in the winter, you definitely want to be mindful that, you know, like I don't want to connect at O'Hare, for example, in the winter. You might want to think about if your product is coming out of that environment, you know, really making sure that you have good backups in place and good processes for if your product misses a flight, for example, or if you're shipping something in a -20, you know, phase change shipper or 2 to 8, you know, does the airport have storage for your material so that it can just put it in the appropriate environment, which will essentially extend the life of the shipper. And so your courier should be thinking about all of these aspects and also about their ability to recover the product in case something happens and then they're not going to be able to get it out. And actually that will depend a lot on their relationship with the airport ground handlers themselves. So there are a ton of nuances, especially working with different origin points, different destination points on recovery, as well as that kind of interim storage if there were some sort of issue related to getting your product out.
So contingency is critical, not just with the courier, but also with the depot. How flexible are they with having to change for seasonal issues? But you want to, by collecting this data, you can identify where we're seeing these issues and then set up these contingencies. So if a depot needs to change a shipper for a different type of ship, an expected potential delays, or change out the courier that they're using to pick up and move that shipment, contingency plans and flexibility is critical for that.
Great. Lastly, about customs requirements, what's on an international, side? What are some, or at least one or two key points that are maybe it might be surprising to the audience on customs clearance and requirements?
Well, I was just saying today that it's kind of a moving target. You may think you know it today, but tomorrow could be completely different. So when you're selecting your vendors, you want to see if they have people, if they have global trade teams that can assist you when you have questions coming up or issues and delays. Does the courier have a team or different vendors, or do you have to get a vendor specifically for that? Do you have the right broker to help assist the shipments? Yeah, just making sure you have that support, because as I said, it's a moving target. It's always changing, and we've seen in the last year or so some interesting complexities with, as we have going through Brexit. I mean, that's something that you want to make sure our vendors are aware of this and monitoring it, because that's going to pose some new challenges.
Yeah, and just speaking to the moving target and things around Brexit. So we get a lot of questions about Brexit, a lot of questions about escalating trade wars. And I think it's important for folks to remember as they're discussing with their vendors that, we don't have a crystal ball, right? We don't know what's going to happen, and neither do any of your other vendors. But what you can, anticipate, what you can expect from them is that they are, as Amy said, monitoring the situation, putting contingency plans in place, that they're demonstrating that they have an understanding of the complexity of the issue and they're thinking about it from multiple different angles. But we have we've had some interactions where folks are really expecting, I think, more information than is really available. And so just to understand, everyone's on the same page, but it's really how they're preparing to react that's important.
Very, very good. Okay, I think we're done with questions. We've kept to our 1 hour commitment. If that should conclude our time. And first, I want to thank the audience. Very attentive and appreciate the questions that were submitted by all, and really appreciate both Amy and Caitlin for excellent presentation on this, and great summarization and follow up in the Q&A. We really appreciate everyone's time, and hope to see you next time. Thank you all very much.